This presentation is going to go over community politics, power, and governance. We'll begin our discussion by thinking about what power actually is and how it relates to this idea of political capital. And power, if we use Weber's definition, which is widely cited across social sciences, is the ability to create or prevent a situation even against the resistance of others. And those who can have their way, even when lots of people object, have power. It's exercised in more than one way. Perhaps the more expensive, more difficult way is through coercion, through the use of force and violence. And the more practical and widely used manner, I guess, for enforcing power is through ideology. Convince people that it's in their interest, that your authority is legitimate, and so on. And what we tend to see is that laws and rules that are developed tend to reflect political capital. Political capital just means that someone's got the power, right? And the ability of a group to influence the distribution of resources within a social unit, including helping with the agenda of what resources are available, right? This is from Flora and Flora on their book, Rural Communities, on page 144. And what we see here is what we might call a real politics definition, because it has to do with resources. And not all politics, if you ever watch news channels and listen to political discussions, almost never do they talk about resource issues. Instead, the focus tends to be on symbolic politics, or the kind of dog and pony shows that distract the masses from the important issues, as some people would put it. Another related concept of importance is pluralism, which has to do with how power is distributed. So is it in the hands of a few, or in the hands of the many, or somewhere in between? Are there checks and balances? Is there a monopoly, or some variation of that? And we'll take a look at some research there, and we'll compare it and contrast it to its opposite, which is elitism, where power is highly concentrated in the hands of only the most powerful. And research on the topic of elitism has tended to follow the lead of Floyd Hunter, who introduced community power studies and used a reputational approach to identify who the elites were. So now that we've covered some of the basic concepts of power and political capital and pluralism, we're now ready to bring those concepts into a broader discussion of community politics. And historically, it's interesting. Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville, a French philosopher and political theorist who was visiting the United States after the Revolutionary War, was kind of quite interested in the robustness of the political system that was developing in the United States. And he observed that it was successful because it was built on a robust network of small businesses and independent farms. Every town had a public forum, and of course, most people lived in one of many small towns. In fact, at the time of the Revolutionary War, only about 5% of people in the United States lived in an urban area. Nearly everybody lived in a small rural community. And this was inextricably tied to the success of democracy, according to Tocqueville, who claimed municipal institutions constitute the strength of free nations. And writing around the time of World War I, the American philosopher, the pragmatist John Dewey, voiced some concerns about the prospects of democracy going forward in an increasingly complex world as industry, globalization, and urbanization continue to unfold. And Dewey noted the importance of public forums, as Tocqueville did, and also really shined a light on the importance of reliable media sources for information to inform public debate. and was really concerned about the propaganda replacing reliable news sources, and assumed that the public organized, that is to say, Dewey assumed that the public was organized in a number of small communities, as was largely still the case by the time of World War I. And the world has been increasingly urbanizing since then, and I would love to hear his views now, were he still alive. In the 1950s and 40s, there was a number of important studies on community politics and also community economics, which we've mentioned in other places, but essentially as communities play host to larger regional or national or global firms, that tends to undermine the civic life of the community, and that has a direct impact on community politics. People become less engaged, less involved, and less locally oriented, and that has supported a movement of political focus to a grander scale, typically the national level. After World War II, focus on communities was replaced by focus on mass society, as we've noted in several places. And so many of these issues of community politics have gone undetected, unstudied, under the radar. But the classic community power structure introduced by Floyd had the following explanatory framework. The idea was to study power structure of the community as a means for understanding civic participation and community problem solving. And as we found in those 1940, 1950 studies, local business owners and corporate executives, who are the economic dominants, played very important roles in the decision-making process. Having a local elite as opposed to having absentee owners or large global corporations around. So Floyd, he devised the following two kind of profiles, I guess, of power structures that you might find in communities that kind of correspond nicely with the Mills and Ulmer economic analysis. And Floyd said, on one hand, you have monolithic power structures where a few absentee-owned firms account for most of the employment. That sounds very consistent with Mills and Ulmer. And there, the interest of the corporation tends to trump that of the broader citizenry. Local residents are alienated from local decision-making and problem-solving, and decision-making is guided by select leadership circles acting on behalf of large employers. And on the other side of the coin, where you have a wider network of small, locally owned firms, is the diversified power structure, which corresponds to our idea of pluralism, and where each individual in the community has a higher share of political capital as opposed to a few individuals. And in diversified power structures, the interest of the community winds up being synonymous with interest in local business, and the place of business and residence is overlapping and the same. And as we see when we talk about civic capitalism and local community economics, economic relationships tend to overlap with social relationships, and local residents become more engaged in local politics. Problem solving is more of a pluralistic affair, and there are a larger number of competing interests. So the nice thing is, when you've got a vibrant local political life, it doesn't have to be necessarily a sort of group think, right? So you have a lot more pluralism that tends to also promote diversity of ideas. And to this day, one of the critical questions of social science is how to promote more civic engagement, particularly among political scientists and also sociologists. So the focus here is on civic welfare and engagement, and arguably there needs to be a combination of strong economic and non-economic civic institutions that will together interact to promote engagement. And without engagement, you don't have local capacity to solve problems or promote welfare and promote future engagement. And that's one of the best predictors of future engagement is past engagement. So research focuses on these interrelationships between these different types of institutions. And Putnam has been a large large voice and character on the subject of civic engagement, civic welfare. It states that getting involved in community affairs is more inviting, or abstention less attractive, when the scale of everyday life is smaller and more intimate. And this is much in line with the observations of Tocqueville as well as John Dewey, mentioned earlier. And Putnam finds through his research that associational membership, that is, if people belong to groups like the Rotary, the Elks, the Masons, or bowling leagues, the title of his book was Bowling Alone, that when you belong to these different groups, you tend to have more civic engagement. Part of that reason may be related to Oldenburg's observation about third places, which are spaces in a community where you can have an informal relationship, informal public life, and of course the important informal discussions about politics and about life in the community. And it's in these places, these third places, that citizens are able to think about what they want for their community and how to get more involved. Irwin and Greeley also find that religious organizations serve a similar function in terms of promoting volunteerism in particular, right? Because a lot of religious organizations encourage their membership to engage in service activities, some kind of volunteerism. And finally, schools are an important civic institution, as found in Ludin's research. School-based civic engagement also was found to promote youth well-being. So all the discussion of community politics, it's worthwhile to take a look momentarily at this idea of leadership, which is actually growing in popularity as a topic, as one of the chapters in one of your textbooks. And leadership is an important factor in local politics. People have to demonstrate leadership. And what we see is civic engagement tends to promote local leadership. And if people are not engaged, they're not likely to take on leadership roles. They're going to resist such roles or involvement at all, let alone be leaders. So leaders are important in the process of community change and development because they help to motivate people, organize and mobilize resources, and make things happen, right? People who set meetings and show up to meetings. According to Robinson and Green, leadership is the behavioral process of influencing the activities of an individual or group to accomplish goals in a given situation. And influencing might be a more passive word than I would use. I think motivating and organizing, right? There's a lot of work goes into getting people to act. And a good leader will be effective at getting people to act in targeted ways. So there's interest currently in creating leaders. You see a rise, for instance, in the number of leadership training courses, seminars, and programs that are being offered. But community leaders must be able to have good coordination and interactional skills, and be willing to build bridging ties. So they have to be comfortable with diversity and pluralism. There's different types of leadership, as we'll see. Symbolic leaders, for instance, do not have power based on position or in the social structure, but have other qualities such as charisma. So charismatic leaders, such as Martin Luther King, were able to influence so many people, not because they occupied a powerful position, but because they simply were very charismatic and people wanted to follow them because they liked what they had to say. Operational leaders are those individuals who act as leaders and derive leadership entirely from their position in the social structure, which looks more like Weber's idea of rational legal leadership. And then Weber also, the classic sociologist Max Weber also pointed to instrumental versus expressive leaders, those who are more emotionally oriented versus those who are more task oriented. And as you can guess, the symbolic leaders tend to be more expressive, while operational leaders tend to be more task-oriented. So this idea that leaders are born and cannot be made, which is a pretty popular sort of slogan or phrase, I guess, doesn't really have much support in the literature. It turns out that there is some benefit to learning about leadership. Now, it is true that some people tend to be more charismatic, which gives them a little bit of an advantage in terms of becoming symbolic leaders and expressive leaders, but that doesn't necessarily mean they'll be effective at getting things done. And sometimes leaders emerge out of situations as demands are there, and somebody has to step in to fill the vacuum. So what is the most effective type of leadership? That's a key question. And research by Lewin following World War II, he was really interested in the rise of Nazi Germany and being a refugee from Germany as his family and so forth. Lewin was interested in the fascist leadership style, and he compared the dictatorship leadership style to the democratic and laissez-faire styles in his experiment. And what he found was the democratic leadership style tended to be the most effective and inclusive. So we could see a parallel, actually, if we read this chapter by Robinson and Green in their typology. They identify developmental leaders, those who promote widespread participation, of getting people involved and being facilitators, which corresponds very nicely to Lewin's democratic leadership style. The directive leaders give orders based on tasks. They don't really take input or ask for it. Sounds more militaristic. Orders flow down, obedience flows up, and that, of course, sounds more dictatorial. And finally, permissive leaders are less involved in facilitating or directing, and are more likely to use rewards to solicit some kind of obedience, which is a little more closely aligned to the laissez-faire style. Leadership style is also related to the concentration of power. When you've got pluralism, that is, power is kind of widely shared, political capital is not concentrated in the hands of an elite, democratic or developmental leadership styles tend to work best. When you do have a power elite and all the political capital is concentrated in a few hands, the directive or dictatorial leadership style tends to thrive. And finally, in a power vacuum, where power structure is ill-defined and there's no clear idea of who's in charge, that's when the permissive, laissez-faire leadership style thrives. And of course, nothing is fixed. If there's a community dominated by a power elite, it could change into being more pluralistic. And I think from a value standpoint, most social scientists and citizens alike hope to see the pluralistic ideal achieved, where power is spread out evenly and there's a democratic process in place. So in conclusion, as we reflect back on this video, we can think of power, or the ability to act even against the resistance of others, as kind of the stuff or the currency of political capital in communities. And the concentration of political capital is what informs our idea of pluralism, or as Floyd Hunter would call it, a diversified power structure versus the monopolized or monolithic power structure. And then the leadership styles that we just discussed correspond to the power structure. In the monolithic case, it tends to be more dictatorial. In the pluralistic case, it tends to be more democratic or developmental. So in conclusion, with pluralist, diversified power structures, we need citizens to be active and motivated in terms of their participation in civic life. Democracy doesn't work if citizens don't participate. It's both a privilege and a responsibility, and a lot of times people don't take that very seriously, unfortunately. So the question then becomes, how do we motivate civic life? And the research tends to suggest that civic life thrives when you have a strong local economy, when you have the presence of many non-economic fraternal organizations, as Putnam found with the Elks, the Rotary, and the bowling clubs, and when life is small scale, as observed by the philosophers John Dewey and Alexis de Tocqueville. And that's going to wrap it up. Thanks for watching.